Give the proper introduction. I think we're good. Hey, Mike, good to see you too. Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming. Just because it's not Cybersecurity Awareness Month anymore, doesn't mean we're ever really done with cybersecurity, right? Very few people are aware of this fact, which does point to a deeper problem in cyber hygiene, doesn't it? So guys, we're very lucky to be joined by one of our distinguished colleagues, a visiting scholar here at the workshop this fall, Subimal Bhattacharjee, or Subi. He's spent nearly 4 years at General Dynamics as leading that group from April 2012 to December. And then he, after that, has had a variety of roles, including as an independent consultant on defense and cyber issues. He's a columnist, quite frequent and prolific columnist, I have to say, including in the Economic Times. There was a great piece that came out just yesterday on AI governance happenings just today. Okay, that's getting picked up a lot. You said you got a call from the Prime Minister's office earlier today. My goodness. And if that weren't enough, also a documentary filmmaker, and one of his films got honorary mention at the Tokyo International Short Film Festival. So how cool is that? And then today, Subi is going to be talking to us a little bit about some of his recent work on, obviously, cyber norms development, or hopefully not lack thereof, and how that overlays well with some of the work here at the workshop. So we're thrilled to have you, Subi, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Of course.
Let me start with this. Sorry.
Great. We should say a special hello to some of our distinguished guests joining online from DC and Chicago as well.
How do I go back?
Oh, yeah. Is it the other direction arrow, perhaps?
Trying to figure that out.
There you go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to my mentor, Professor Shackelford. I think, as he said, I really don't fit in an academic or I don't have an academic background as such, but I've been in the industry at the cusp of defense and cyber, and for 25 years, I've been a very avid follower of what happens at the policy level, at a global level. And all these 25 years, I actually have been writing at all the epochs I feel that covers this space. So all these writings don't have any academic or political science or international relations leanings, or I can say tone, but they very much touch upon how this space needs to be looked at from a practitioner's point of view. Having worked in the defense industry, which relies now more and more on technology, and specifically the fear that artificial intelligence is today kind of generating everywhere. Whether you look at the weapons, whether you look at the overall force multiplication capabilities, I think we cannot stay away from not looking at a regulatory perspective when it comes to the tech space. So the trigger hasn't been artificial intelligence for this. The trigger has been the concerns that information communications technology has an impact on international security. And that's back in 2004, when the Russian resolution in the General Assembly actually got the first GGE working. And then subsequently, we have had quite a few of them. 3 of them gave results. The 2009 GGE, the 31 people were invited in Unity in Geneva to sort of work on the agenda, and I happen to be one of them, and the only one from India at that point of time. That was the first one that actually generated a consensus and a report. But the most substantial GGE that gave a report or a consensus report was in 2015, which actually laid out those 11 norms that you can see up. It was not a very easy exercise to arrive at these norms. At some point of time, 15 nations were there. At some point of time, 20 nations. At the last one had 25. But there wasn't any kind of a classification in which those countries were chosen. While internet and cyberspace have been looked at more from a multi-stakeholder perspective, but here when the UN conversations happened around the norms or the GG, it was at a multilateral level. Maybe I will touch on this multilateral versus multi-stakeholder politics also a little bit in this whole thing. But what's very important to understand is that in 2015, these norms were put in place or agreed upon. And then the next GG, where the nomenclature of the GG change in a group of governmental experts, or the impact of, for responsible, advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Now that was an American resolution, and parallelly with that, there was another resolution where the open-ended working group on cyber was formed. So the 2019 GG, which gave its report in June 2021, basically went into details into all these 15 norms that were defined by the 2015 GG, went in details, distilled them, and looked at it more from a perspective of how that could be implemented, looking at how nations looked at cyberspace from various interests. And then, right now, the open-ended working group, the OEWG, is working on all the same, the norms, the principles, and a way forward. And they have a mandate till 2025 in this. So if you saw the GG of 2021 giving you a report with kind of clearly defining those 13 norms, and in my paper, I have put the 11 norms, the 13 A, B, C, D, that's how I went, because, 13 was the section in the actual report. So you can go to that report and, find far much more detailed stuff up there. But what's important to understand is that what GG has left it, the OEWG now has a larger role to look at all of them to see that the effort forward is more of a continual or maybe going even towards a permanent dialogue or institution or organization forward. And looking at the recent geopolitics that's going around, you saw the Ukraine war, you right now see what's happening in the Middle East, the concerns around China that a lot of people try to raise, or even, the way the whole geopolitics is shaping up. Getting the OEWG to be able to deliver something that can be seamlessly put in an institutionalized form is not that very easy. I could qualify that later, in the form of some question answer kind of a thing. But here we are with all these 11 norms. And if you try and do a kind of a summary of how these norms stand out. So these are the principles which kind of, show in all these 11 norms. The concept of sovereign equality. One of my colleagues here, JC Schindler, when she presented, she spoke about sovereignty and all. Sovereignty again is, and I know I'm trying to attempt to answer all this thing in front of a great Professor Michael McGuinness, who is here. When it goes to something, which cannot be so easily defined in terms of boundary and all, the whole concept of sovereignty itself has its own different connotations. So looking at how the UN effort took sovereignty as a base to communicate, get into the norms, announce these norms, have the clauses of non-intervention, then also factor in the duty of care, preventing harm. That's a very, very important aspect, because that is where the absence of geography and the possibility of anonymity allows every individual to an institution, to rogue nations, to everyone to use these to do something, because spoofing and attribution still remain major issues that have to be solved from a technical standpoint, and I don't see a solution that is in the horizon so very soon. And then on top of it, go to the confidence building measures. Look at the human rights and international law. It's a very, very important thing, because when the work on the norms have happened, whether in the 2013 GG, 2015 GGB, and then reiterated in the 2021 report, the application of international law in cyberspace has been very, very clearly stated, including the international humanitarian law. So I think the intent of the norms and the principles, as well as the respect for international law, is very, very important, even as we look forward in the institutional build-up. And then, of course, the protection of intellectual property, privacy, the extent of capacity building in which all kinds of institutions and organizations can perform or have to be, optimal. All these things have been taken care of in the norms. So this is a kind of a summarized kind of a statement. I tried to qualify a little bit in the paper. Now, I must also put this caveat up, that this paper is the first draft, and I have 1.5 months more here to make it a little bit more academic and more, incisive, with a lot of more factual and research related content. This is something that I tried to be a little bit bold about. Now, I never studied the Ostrom design principles before I came here, but I was really, I should say, all my concepts became clear as I read through and I attended the classes of Professor McGuinness, Professor Dan Cole, Professor Eduardo, a few of them that I attended here on Tuesday afternoons. They've been really nice, and I even was bold to put a column up when the third Nobel Prize in economics was won by a lady, Professor Claudie, about 2 weeks back, on how, Elinor Ostrom signifies something far much significant from many perspectives, when it comes to look at global political economic issues. But if you, again, look at how cyberspace fits in, or more so the norms around cyberspace fits into the Ostrom design principles, I think that these few things are well clarified. Only the first one, the clearly defined boundaries, although in my paper I have tried to give again the same explanation of this concept of sovereign nations, and hence that concept is defining the boundary. But possibly this is something that needs to be far much more studied, not only at my end, but collectively, about where Ostrom design principles around the clearly defined boundaries could apply. And this would be very, very important also, from a perspective of the UN or anybody that would look at it when it would come to building the regulatory mechanism, because you have to reduce the scope for interpretation and conflicts, when you would actually try to put across an institutional format for looking at cyberspace. I think congruence with local conditions, definitely most of the countries have their own laws and rules and regulations in which they are trying to manage their own cyberspace. Rest all of the things I've put in the paper. I think, again, the concept of polycentric governance is very much seen or applied in this current unregulated scenario also of cyberspace. Conflict resolution mechanisms are more or less, The conflict resolution mechanisms are also mostly built around bilateral, or maybe I can say some specific groups of nations, or even the different stakeholders, whether at the technical level or even at the functional level. The way you are looking at, mostly if you see the MLATs, the mutual legal treaty agreements, that has been the yardstick that have looked at addressing the cyber crimes, which are far much more prominent than many other aspects when it comes to the governance of cyberspace. And then, of course, the gradual adaptation, that's getting into the system. You see, more and more people are getting into the bandwagon of internet. More and more people are getting into doing a lot of functions. More and more people, without the possibly the requisite qualification or adequate qualifications to be, say to be, or maybe people who are not necessarily literate are also today very much using their mobiles to do a lot of transactions and stuff like that. I give the example of the digital payment ecosystem in India today. On a daily basis, 46% of the global transactions that happen anywhere in the world is from India, and the majority of them, 80% of them, are doing that payment from their mobile devices. It is the vegetable vendor, it is the rickshaw puller, all of them are. So they do not have the adequate understanding of the laws or the mechanism in which it functions, but they are working in a trusted system. So that gradual adaptation of all categories of people into this, I think this also is something which we can look at. This is another area where I'm going to work significantly in the next couple of weeks here. So what I tried to do post that was see that if we are trying to look at regulating cyberspace at a global level, and we have all kind of conflicting situation, and you look at geography, you look at anonymity, you look at the geopolitics, you look at how countries have addressed the whole issue of rule making. You look at the way the transnational aspects of cyber crimes. I tried to go in a direction where I looked at the regulatory environment in two directions. One, you could look at the strategic dimension. The other, you could look at the tactical dimension. Now, these are my defense industry terms that are flowing out, but I think from or in trying to draw some clarity about how we would want to define it, this possibly gives an answer. I'm subject to all corrections and comments. So if I take outer space, climate, high seas, and then compare cyberspace, and Professor Shackelford's book was very, very useful. It's so detailed and it's gone into much of this far much than anywhere I have read till this date. So if you by and large look at these three areas, there are today agreements that allow outer space, climate, and high seas to be not chaotic as it can be. There isn't any sense of chaos or a global concern that has come to that alarming level when you haven't found a way to solve the issues that have come to the fore. Maybe climate is still more evolving compared to outer space and the high seas. I think climate is something that I was talking to Yanhua just before we started this, that a diabetologist once told me that the shark below the water might be just a few feet below, 1,000 feet below, but the shark is a shark, it will attack a human. So he was giving a comparison with diabetes, that this is the disease that a lot of people try and avoid, but they don't understand at what point it will turn in the other side. So when it comes to climate, I think we are trying to push across the threshold, and there are conflicting scenarios, but still it is something that you could look at a more strategic perspective. That's where cyberspace also has a lot of connotations. If you look at larger defining aspects of cyberspace and its impact, if you compare it even from how it shapes up with climate and all, the impact of the expanded infrastructure, the impact of the servers, the impact of the space that you take, the impact on global warming, everything. So there is a larger strategic angle when it comes to how this whole digital situation is covered. It's very important to understand that there isn't, we aren't going to see that people are going to move away from being a part of the digital ecosystem. I think it has come to us, or we have imbibed it in such a way, and states, governments, or communities even have gone to a level where they've inured themselves to its usage in such a way that we are never going to go down, we are going to increase. The point that I'm to make is that if we're going to increase our footprints and everything, then the impact on environment, the impact on the strategic aspects become very, very important. And so from that perspective, a regulatory regime has to look at a larger strategic perspectives. I then go to the technical part where I compare it with the nuclear and the civil aviation sectors. And if you see that these two could become threats in their own rights, it also could become threats with the force multiplication with cyber, critical infrastructure as civil aviation sector or the air traffic control system. If God forbid, if someday a massive cyber attack happens, then its impact is catastrophic impact. Apart, the impact on how it could trigger a geopolitical or even a global conflict is today far much more pronounced in everyone else. Likewise, a nuclear attack. And for your information, a lot of the cyber attacks are actually generated in these two sectors. So if you look at the importance with which you need to look at the sectors, even the other critical infrastructure, but if you look at the impact that could happen, that from that perspective, there is a technical response that needs to be made. And hence you must have an ecosystem in which you could respond or do an incident response in that period of time, in that defined set pattern rules of engagement or the standard operating protocols as it is known as. So I think irrespective of whichever way you look at, the effort of the norms to a great extent has been to see that we come towards a certain semblance of an institutional mechanism as a mechanism in which you could govern the whole space of cyberspace. Whether we look at the multi-stakeholder approach that has been popular with US and many countries, and India also joined this bandwagon from a multilateral to multi-stakeholder, I think in August 2016, or even from a multilateral perspective. But I think that realization to have norms as a basis for an institutional framework, that has been very well encapsulated when the GGs met. And this I'm telling you from no footnotes that would be seen anywhere on the net or even any kind of academic publication, but from my interaction with many of the people who attended the GGs, as members or as the support staff and all. So there is a normative framework that comes through these norms. There is a governance structure. There are institutional entities, the capacity building, the monitoring and reporting possibilities, and the collaboration and coordination. By and large, the norms have put all this when it has set forth those 11 norms. And thus, I think this should give us a guidance about how could we look at the post OEWG 2025, when you look at a forward much more continual basis of looking at cyberspace regulation. This could be the triggers that allow a certain sense of building an institutional framework. And hence, if you look at the nature of an institution and functions, when we go to that post 2025 scenario, we could still be looking at the developing the international norm. In fact, the mandate of the OEWG, even right now, is also to build on the norms or, refine them, improve them, suggest new norms. Capacity building and technical assistance, I think that's going to be perennially important. So how do you factor it within an institution? Obviously, it won't be one of entity within whatever institutional framework you do. There has to be a lot of collaboration because of the private sector, the research institutions, the legal community, all of them will have to be working in tandem. So capacity building and technical assistance goes in many directions. Information sharing and collaboration remains very important. I think today the world communicates as far as information sharing is concerned, but I think it is still not optimal and it's sometimes very much biased. And to a great extent, geopolitics comes into this information sharing. Because mediation and conflict resolution and monitoring and reporting. Now, how do you have this reporting mechanism? How do the countries find the right incident response or incident response support immediately after a massive cyber attack goes on? I think these are still very, very skewed and not up to a level that it gives a comfort when you look at it from a larger global perspective. So maybe the road ahead is you need an institution. Mm-hmm. That institution comes in the form of only a binding agreement or agreements, or even you look at the organization. If you see, I put the picture of the United Nations in Geneva and not closer here to in New York. Because in Geneva, you have two of the institutions, ITU and UNIDIR, both under UN. They are looking at many aspects of, what would broadly cover the whole aspect of cyberspace management or cyberspace governance. In fact, if you look at ITU today, ITU's functions by and large to a great extent have been or has become a subset of the larger story of the digital ecosystem. Telecom just remains a part of the digital ecosystem, and telecom today survives on the digital ecosystem. Telecom's earlier analog story is almost out of fashion, and everything today is based on this. So the technical infrastructure of the internet ecosystem is something that is just a part of the larger story. It is an important part of the story because they are the enablers. And then you have the UNIDIR, which has been trying to look at, what we are talking right now. As I said, in 2008, I had gone to Geneva as in the same building as part of the discussion. So they have been doing this job for a pretty long time. Now, what the General Assembly resolutions have looked at, what the recent Security Council as well as the General Assembly efforts in looking at artificial intelligence more specifically. This year in July, the Security Council had a particular event only on artificial intelligence. So all of that, I think there is a need for an institution or an organization, whether a revamped UN that everyone now speaks about, also looks at a revamped ITU and UNIDIR and those functions put together in an institution that has a binding agreement and then run through an organization. I think this is something that I am trying to project as part of the final effort that I'll be doing in the next few weeks. But definitely it has to look at the larger participation of nations and other stakeholders, and that the whole effort around an OEWG beyond the GGE was also that the more number of nations get involved. The GGE at the most at 25 nations. OEWG has everyone's participation. Everyone has been trying to put across their point of view despite their varied scenarios. So this is where I see that we need to really proceed. So thank you. Lovely fall, and thanks to the Ostrom directors and everyone who got me in the chance to have an opportunity to not only do some research here, but also walk around the trees and enjoy the music in Jacob School almost every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you won in terms of the punch card for most Jacob's performances. That was just, I'm glad you've been able to take full advantage. I'm jealous, frankly. And I'm glad you're able to share these findings, because we've had a lot of wonderful dialogues, but you haven't yet had a chance to share more broadly. So this is terrific. So the floor is open as always. We'll have the chat going here. I'll monitor that, and then folks in the room can discuss. And then maybe if you're willing, Mike, you can kick us off and have some thoughts. Great. That's fantastic.
Interesting set of problems here, or pieces towards building some sort of way forward. I was struck that you didn't talk about the ITU in this paper. I'm glad you mentioned it here at the end. Could you talk a little bit more about what role you see the International Telecommunications Union and its associated and its related sort of organizations and the internet kinds of organizations? How does that feed into this? How do you see that playing a role?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Should I go one by one like this?
I think let's do one by one, and we'll turn to Pradeep next. Yeah.
So ITU as an organization, Professor, today has a very, very limited role. It almost doesn't have a role, but it's a kind of a bureaucracy that is being sustained or probably prolonged. And hence ITU needs to get into a role much possibly beyond the technical aspects, which I don't think a lot of the nations want that. So you need to completely redefine ITU. Now, if you redefine ITU, then what are the other elements that should get into that whole technical standardization, or whatever the telecom related technical stuff that they've been looking at, and or even the other related policy. So I think the larger superset is today the overall digital ecosystem, where, as I said, UNITID has been doing work, but it's more on the larger policy aspects. So a revamped ITU, whether you name it, United Nations Information or United Nations Cyberspace Organization, whatever term we need to give, I think it has to, ITU get coalesced into that along with all other functions, and possibly ITU doesn't remain an ITU anymore. It's a much more UN cyber something. That's how I would see it.
It's an interesting backstory, just if I may, about why the ITU is not more involved, right? Because basically they had helped to sponsor the development of this OSI protocol, which was going to be the universal translator for cyberspace. But that got sidelined when TCP/IP came about, which was more or less a project of grad students that really took off and spread worldwide. So the ITU could have been much more front and center, but this other option of it was available. It was free. It worked quite well. And so they never really got to be what they are for telecom regulations in terms of internet governance. But there's certainly lots of countries that would like to see them more front and center. And they still do some capacity building work with certs, advising on cybercrime laws, stuff like that. But it's not front and center like Subi described.
Can I follow up on that? Because I was also interested in the more private or oriented sort of internet sort of connection. And would that be part of what you see in this organization? That the UN sort of connecting into that as well? Or do you see this as something separate from private. And I mean, I can see both ways or either way.
It's so pertinent, you asked this question. So taking a little bit from what Professor Shackelford said, the multi-stakeholder lobby or approach never wanted, ITU to get into the picture.
Right.
Partially because of, the OSINT versus the TCP/IP protocol story, but partially also because the bureaucracy within ITU didn't seem to be answering the needs of the time. So, and the multi-stakeholder approach had far much better encapsulation and understanding about how to involve the private sector, the industry, the technical community, all of them. So the silos in which they operated, they could actually come into that kind of a structure, not into the ITU bureaucracy. So that's a thing that if you have a larger UN structure, then keeping the essence of the multi-stakeholder entity, and if you see the multi-stakeholder push was led by the US, which has been in principle accepted by the UN. So and it's going to be the way forward. So in that, I think there will be a space for everyone to operate and engage.
It's a classic push and pull between the consensus multilateral model and this big tent approach, right? Pradeep, let's turn to you next, then we can maybe circle back on that.
Thank you, Scott and Subimal, for giving me a chance to come to this conference today. Thank you, Ostrom, also. I was just going through the presentation. Subimal mentioned about the comparison with the high seas, climate, outer space, etc. But if you see the cyberspace, how it grew, maybe a long time ago, 40, 50 years ago, it grew with the internet, the network of the networks, and it is largely centralized. Unlike other domains of high seas, climate, and the outer space, which is largely decentralized, this internet is centralized, and all networks have to follow the protocols what is there with the since the beginning. So maybe that some clue lies here also for the regulation of the cyberspace, that how to go about it. This is just my imagination, what I thought I should share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Just for everyone's knowledge, Mr. Pradeep Gupta was an officer in the government of India who worked for more than a decade with the President of India, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, in all the foreign policy, defense, and national security issues and all. Gupta ji, the way I would answer you is that yes, definitely the protocols are defined. So to a great extent, you have a glue somewhere putting the technical or the connectivity part here. But the larger point of, around issues and where today, the lot of the functions that happen and the functions that happen or which have become a possibility because of this glue are today themselves so strong in their own capacity as enablers of some form of governance that you have to look at it much also from a strategic perspective. So while you have the glue around, you need to look at a larger strategic perspective about where these functionalities of governance are going and how do you have a certain sense of regulatory approach to them.
Thank you. Thank you.
And yeah, you turn to Gustavo. Yeah.
Very interesting. I don't know much about cyber security and these topics, but I was thinking if an approach that focus more on what are the issues, where are the conflict of interest on how to govern this resource, and then from there go into, well, how those issues are being solved, what are the problems, So in some sense, for example, with the protocols, for me, it seems like, well, there's no issue, no? So essentially, one protocol emerged, people adopt it, they found it solve the problem. So, okay, so what are the remaining issues, no? So that again, going from there, it's like what people want to revisit the protocols, they want to do it differently. There are conflict of interest. Some countries want one thing, some other countries want different things. So, and then from there, go into, well, can we find deals, agreements that will manage those conflict of interest or those potential areas of cooperation in a better way? So more focus on agreement rather than on organizations, because something I'm noticing in international relations is an over-focus on organizations, and then rather than on agreements, you know? So essentially, and then at the end, you have nation states coming up with agreements, no? And then the organizations pretty much, they just offer space for these deals to happen, no? They are not running the war, no? So essentially.
Very nice, Professor Gustavo. In fact, I must tell that every of the colloquiums and presentations I sat here and I heard you ask questions, I always learned a lot. So you have so much of knowledge on so many things. Very, the conflict of interest part that you said is very important. The whole history about this discussion actually started on the conflict of interest. If you see the Russian resolution that came first in 2004, it was a kind of a pitch saying, oh, the Americans have so much of a hold on the ICT technology. And so all of the thing about GG is about international security. So they were trying to push in the UN that, look, they have all wherewithals of the ICT technology, which they are going to put in the military equipments and everything. That becomes a force multiplier, and we are going to be left behind because, the legacy of the Russian equipments and all of this story. So that's how it started. And right beginning, I said, that many GGs didn't result in a consensus and hence no report, but in others it happened. So a lot has been covered in those discussions. And I'll just tell you that when I was in the, I think that same 2008 meeting for setting the agenda for the 2009 GG. So the US had a big delegation. Russians also had an equally big delegation. Andrei Khrushchev used to lead the Russian delegation. We from India, we just had one second secretary from the disarmament division sitting. China also had 3-4 people. But both the Russian side and the US side, during the lunch and everything, they told, you guys have a great position to do the balancing act and take this forward. One, because of how India did well in the software space, and hence you have an understanding about how this whole digital tech space happens. And so at that point of time, both they were recognizing that they kind of were coming in a different domain with conflicting positions. But if you see all through the work in the last 2 decades, they have come closer. The last GG report, the consensus report, of 2021, it's a great effort. If you see the way the Chinese or the Iranians and many others were trying to raise their opposition to many things, but everyone coming together. So I think the conflict of interest part has been quite well understood and addressed, and hence sort of given a possibility to a path forward through the 2021 to 2025 OEWG that is working now. But in the OEWG, in the substantive meetings and intercession activities that have happened, you haven't seen much. It has proceeded. It has been very slow, and to an extent, when the Russian-Ukraine war came in and all, many things got into that direction also in the OEW. So now you don't have much time. 25 it ends, and before that you have to build a lot of things. So I am assuming in the next few months and period of time, we are going to see far much more closer acceptability of things. And that brings me to the point that you make that possibly binding agreements are a better maybe entity than looking at an organization and feeding a new set of bureaucracy and stuff like that. But binding agreements, again, in that, how do you factor in all the, different players, as the professor had also mentioned? There is a very strong technical community that works, who are building up the next steps. You see, technology is always a disruptor. So you'll have many things happening. There might be a completely game-changing technology that comes. The way we are now all focused on AI, something bigger than AI might also turn up. The academic community, they're working on many lines. The industry, the money is there. So that's where, how do you regulate them? It's not going to be something very easy. If you saw the president's executive order on AI done day before yesterday, there are a number of areas in which 90 days, 270 days, 360 days kind of a approach has been put to be able to harmonize only around one area of artificial intelligence. So how do you play all of them around a binding agreement unless you have a certain kind of a permanency in nature? That's going to be something that I personally have thought is something that I have to do in the next few weeks of the research. And there has to be a permanency. It cannot be a GG or a OEWG, which is keeping it very loose. That's the reason we couldn't implement the norms to any aspect in all these months. It's all free for all right now that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Ukraine has really brought that to the fore because of these norms not being operationalized and issues like dispute settlement and attribution. And so one thing, what we'd love to frankly just get your thoughts on in terms of a way forward are, all right, on the one hand, there's not a consensus around cyberspace being a common, similar to outer space that we've talked about, right? Which is what's feeding a lot of this. There's a growing recognition of cyber sovereignty, even here in the US and in the EU with their technological sovereignty goals. So this whole idea of the internet being open, secure, interoperable, kind of out the window. But the question is, what's next, right? Including how do we regulate that at the international level? And there could be a UN framework convention, the way we've done for climate change, for cyber. So you start with the big tent, then you have specific narrow agreements to deal with different issues like ransomware. You could do like a UN office approach, like we do for outer space affairs. But the issue there again is you got to reach consensus across lots of different players. And hasn't been easy in that context, certainly wouldn't be easy in cyber. So, teasing out those analogies gets us some of the way there, but only some of the way. So that's some of the things that we'd love to get, thoughts on, I think it's fair to say. Cool. All right. Other questions, other comments?
Scott.
Oh, please. I'm so sorry to block you too.
Just want to acknowledge that Subi, I met him just a couple of months ago, and why he took one of my classes. And then from that, I realized that he's actually coming to IU with you. So, oh, wow, that's an interesting one. Actually, it's not a political science question, more of a crime related. That I think that any institutional approach to specific, large scale problems are only going to be addressed towards only, those areas, as you rightly mentioned, where there is some kind of a consensus and it sort of benefits everybody. And in some other spheres, it's impossible to bring any consensus. Crime is one example. I mean, let's talk about terrorism, which everybody knows. So there's no consensus, and everybody. Yeah, I mean, it would be best right now to sort of have United Nations involvement in Middle East and Ukraine or something, but that's not really going to happen. So similarly, in when we have a cyberspace and that we are thinking about, will there be any consensus in terms of dealing with cyber crimes? So this Nigerian guy who's offering me millions of dollars, can something be done about that, or
So thank you so much. Professor Verma is the professor of criminal justice here in the Indiana University. He was a very distinguished police officer in India before he did his PhD and came here, and for more than 3 decades now you are here. And I happened to take one of his classes with a lot of police officers from India, some of the brilliant lot. on, the applications of the criminal justice system, how do you utilize data analysis, data analytics, and it's getting more and more. But to answer your question, sir, so the UN has been also trying to grapple with crime, but if you leave aside the UN part, the effort to look at the online crime was first attempted at a consolidated level when the Budapest Convention of 2001. But if you saw, most nations or many important nations also didn't want to ratify the terms of that agreement. Even today, India hasn't ratified. US did it very late. So there are differing positions when it comes to looking at crime, and you are the best in that. And as cybercrime, it's far much more dangerous because you are committing a crime in one country, committed by a nationality of another country, using the network of another, and using a product of another and playing it on another. So 5-6 countries you immediately get across. So the huge jurisdictional stories that come in. So I think that is where the crime parts will still not have an answer. But here, when we are looking at the international security aspect, I think it elevates much above crime, and where there is an understanding that somewhere that medium has to be protected and kept, and things keep on growing. And that's where consensus building might be much easier compared to when dealing with the crime part. Or the other thing that I could even say that the United Nations actions on terrorism and crime has been far much late and still subdued and still not accepted by many nations. So, so if India is pushing a lot on the terrorism and cross-border terrorism part, but many nations haven't been doing it. So.
Yeah, it's a good point. You'd think crime would be one of those areas that we can come together, right? And there's been more of it, as you said, with the Budapest Convention. There was a new protocol last year and a half ago. But even there, right? I mean, crime, spam, come on. These are the low-hanging fruit. Nobody likes these things. We have a few minutes. Any other questions, comments, suggestions about ways to take this? We love a treaty for cyberspace, but that's very unlikely. Yeah.
I have some recommendation regarding your response to Professor Gustavo feedback. I would like to see your work dig deeper more about policy intervention. If you can give some policy recommendation in a strategic policy intervention to make agreement possible in the real situation, it might be interesting, because I think you try to study about implementation of the norm in the international level, but looks like you confront with the power and institutional arrangement. If you can address the challenges and you can recommend some of the policy intervention to make it possible, it might be fascinating.
Sure, Chang. I think intent is that the last slide, where I had put the institution, agreements, organization, the idea is to get deep into that and see that, post OEWG. So OEWG, in my opinion, will give out a certain sense of a policy direction about how these norms, the principles, and a road ahead materializes. Till now, there hasn't been really much quality discussion to that part. It is still now at the very preliminary. They are trying to say that all nations should have a POA, a kind of a point of contact, or POC rather, point of contact who would be responsible for the international conversations to happen. So we are at the early stage. But I think before 2025, that's going to come out of it, because they wouldn't want to leave it very open and go. So as this, or right from say the 2024-2025 period of time. That's where this conversation happens. The idea is to put across some kind of research work through this paper and be able to even project it to them. And here is something that you could look at. So you are very right. I'll absolutely address this. Thank you.
And maybe to help, finish this out, Subi, since we only have a few minutes left, this is a really easy, softball question. AI. You just did a great piece, which I'd recommend to everybody if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, that came out today. Obviously, the London, summit's happening today on AI. We have a panel at 6 o'clock today, if anybody's interested, with Amanda Craig Decker, the IU alum, who heads up responsible AI at Microsoft. We'll be talking about it. So, it took more than 10 years to get from the Obama administration's international strategy for cyberspace to these 11 cyber norms. We have a lot of work being done to figure out responsible use of AI around the world, public and private sectors. What do you see as the road ahead, and what are some lessons learned from the cyber context as we think about regulating this related context of AI?
Thank you, Professor. Some conversations are already in the public domain about having norms defined for AI. So I think consciously or subconsciously, people have looked back at what has happened in cyber norms. So that period of time from Obama administration's time to 2021, when actually you have this in place, I think that time has been shortened for AI. The trigger of AI really creating catastrophic situations was when ChatGPT came out last year. And then after that, Sam Altman and Geoffrey Quinton's media out stories, I think, have put everyone on their feet. I think the discussion has started. The London cyber meet today is more on the safety part and all. I'm glad the US Vice President went. I'm not very sure how many more number of leaders have come to make this as a really the trigger point, which also brings me to the point that I mentioned to you in the morning, that the EU versus UK race also, who leads on AI, is going to be far much more shriller. The EU already has the act passed by the parliament and now being discussed with the countries, and they have a target before the end of the year to have the legislation. And mind you, their legislations, their regulations always have been very, very tough. And the receiving end of all of them has been the large US big tech, what you call all through. To a great extent, I would think they are very harsh than what they really deserve, because everything was at an evolving phase. But having said so, I think the global consensus on AI is emerging far faster. Before the London summit, you saw, China also come up extensively with its own AI regulations. To a great extent, they are in line with the president's EO, which came day before yesterday. But the Chinese have taken it in a very stringent way about how to deal with, the right from the training of the models to the output and how you are applying and everything. So I think they have graded it very well. The EU also lists everything here. So I'm sure the bureaucracy here, the administration will put all of these things in place. There is one in December that's going to come up in India, which is the summit of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. So this is 29 countries, 28 plus EU. And if you see, President Biden, even during his EU announcement speech, as well as in previous public utterances on AI, has always mentioned the Hiroshima process, the G7's Hiroshima process, which was put in place in May this year, that they have also been working about how do you look at responsible AI. In fact, on 30th, they gave out 2 specific documents, and that's housed at the OECD, but they also gave out policy documents about how you will proceed with responsible AI. So G7 is on the table. You have China, US, the London summit, the EU regulation all in place. And then you have the GPI that will happen in India. GPI primarily was more around the research part and all, but it's also getting more into a more of a policy formulation. I think in this period of time from the London summit to whatever has been put by these countries, a lot of distillation will happen, and possibly GPI will see a good, you can say, a kind of a direction about how it moves forward. But I think I told you in one of my conversations earlier that AI has hijacked the cyberspace dialogue. So I think the norms that you or we discussed today, they possibly would now be the number 2 priority. Number 1 priority would be an agreement, a global binding agreement on AI. That's how I would see it.
Well, would love to continue, but unfortunately we're out of time. So please join me in thanking Subi for his excellent presentation paper. And there's cookies. And like we said, we'll continue the conversation. Anybody interested today? I think Lori Burns McRobbie is going to be on that too, which will be good.